So we're going to discuss adding and subtracting rational expressions. But before we get into that, we need to just review a little bit just adding normal fractions. Let's say 1/2 plus 3/5. So what we need to do is get a common denominator. So we multiply these together, which makes the denominator 10. Now 2 times what is 10? So 2 times 5 is 10, so we multiply this by 5. And then we multiply this by 2, and I multiply that by 2. So really we're talking 5/10 plus 6/10, which gives us, now we add these. We don't add the denominators, we stay the common denominator. So when we are going to add and subtract rational expressions, we're first going to start with already having a common denominator. So we're just going to add the numerators, keep the common denominator, and merge into one fraction. So instead of having two fractions, we just want one. So these are already common denominators. We're going to just make one fraction, and we're going to merge these together, and luckily we can add x plus 3x to become 4x. And now we're going to take it like we did a previous lesson, we're just going to reduce. So we can divide both these monomials by 2, which will give us 2x over 5. Okay, same thing here, same denominator, so we're going to keep that common denominator. We're going to merge these together. Well, we really can't add them together because they're not like terms, but what we can do is we can factor. So decide what you can pull out, which happens to be a GCF of 3. Divide everything by 3. So now we're looking at 3x plus 4 over x minus 4. These are not identical, so then we're done. Okay, same common denominator here. We're going to merge them into one. We're going to go 2x minus that whole second fraction. So you got to remember that we're minusing both of these. So it's 2x minus 1. And then these are going to cancel, and that's going to leave you with -1 over x plus 3. Just be really careful about the minus sign in front of more than one term because it does distribute out. Alright, so now we're going to go into adding and subtracting fractions without the common denominator. So feel free to look at page 385. It gives a more detailed account of what you should do. We're going to go through a couple step-by-step process here. So first thing is you're going to have to get the common denominator. And that's going to be really difficult for some people. So how do we go about doing that? Well, first let's talk about the least common multiple, which is the least common denominator. So if I gave you a problem like this on the bottom, or this, and I say, what's your common denominator? Well, what you're going to want to do is factor first. So this factors down into these two. And then our common denominator, what we're going to do when it deals with binomials here, these are all binomials, is you want to take anything that's common and write it down. So in this case, our common information is an x minus 5. So then I'm going to check mark that because that's what's common. And then you want to take all the non-common information and write that down as well. So the non-common stuff is this x plus 5. So we're going to go ahead and write that down. So that is what we call the least common multiple / the least common denominator. Okay, so that's what happens when there's parentheses involved. Now if it's a monomial, let's say like 2x and 8x, what you could do is you can just multiply them together. I wouldn't call this the least common denominator, but it is a common denominator. Not a big deal, you can just reduce at the end. So if you do go that route, you would write 16x squared. There is a least common denominator of just 16x, but a lot of people don't see that, so you could, again, just multiply these together if they're monomials. Alright, so let's write that down again. If they're monomials only, we could just multiply both denominators together. And then you have to multiply the numerator by the same thing you multiply the denominator by. So if my common denominator is 16x squared, okay, you had to multiply this by 8x, so you got to multiply that by 8x. So that becomes 32x. You got to multiply that by 2x, so then you got to multiply that by 2x. Now the other way to get a common denominator, if it's not monomial, as remember, is to factor the denominator first, and then come up with your least common multiple or least common denominator by taking what's common and then taking what's not common. But we don't distribute. We just write them next to each other. So don't forget, we need to get that common denominator before we do anything. Here's our example, okay, so 2x, 10x, we can multiply those together and that'll give us 20x squared. It's not the least, but hey, it'll work. So we multiply this by 10x, this by 10x. We're going to multiply this by 2x, so we're going to multiply this by 2x, but notice it's a binomial here, so we're going to multiply everything by 2x. So that's how you can rewrite them. Now we're not doing anything with these yet. We're going to come back to these. But that's how you rewrite them to get a common denominator. We're going to have to change the numerators as well. Okay, because this is a binomial, we need to factor it first. So first, we're going to factor the denominator. And that one we can't factor. Then we're going to get our least common multiple, which is our least common denominator. So we're going to take what they have in common, which is really nothing. These are monomials though, so we're going to multiply those together. And then we're going to take what's not common, write them next to each other. We don't distribute, just leave them the way they are. And again, because we have monomials involved, this may not be the least, but that's okay. We can just factor at the end and reduce at the end. Alright, so we had to multiply this by 4x and by x minus 3. So we need to do the same thing, by 4x and by x minus 3. So that will give me 20x, and now I got to still do x minus 3. So that's 20x squared minus 60x. Alright, on this one, from here to here, I just had to multiply by 6x squared, so I'm going to multiply this by 6x squared. Now that's as far as we're going to take it just for now. We'll come back to these, but that's how you get a common denominator, and then you have to change the numerators. So we got a common, we factored it, we got our least common multiple or our least common denominator, and then we fixed the numerators. So remember, we're going to factor the denominators first. Now we're going to get our common denominator. So we're going to start with what they share. They share an x plus 3. And they don't share these. So we're just going to write them all side by side. So this is your new common denominator, side by side. Alright, now we're going to change the numerators. Alright, so here's how we change it. We look at the old denominator, we look at the common denominator. What's different? Well, this has an extra x minus 3, so we need to multiply this by x minus 3. So we need to distribute. And that gives me negative 3x, and 1x, and negative 3. Alright, now let's look at this old denominator to this common denominator. What's different? Well, this has another x plus 3, so we're going to multiply that by x plus 3. So again, once the common denominator exists, so like once we get done doing this, now what do we do? So let's go back up. I said we're going to come back to these. So once the common denominator exists, then you are going to merge into one fraction. So now instead of two fractions, we merge them into one. We write 20x squared, that's my common denominator. And I have 30x plus 4x squared plus 2x. Well, now I'm going to simplify. That's 4x squared plus 32x. But I can factor this binomial. I can take out a 4x, which leaves me with x plus 8. And then I can reduce. So 4 over 20 gives me a 5 in the bottom. And x over an x squared gives me an x in the bottom. And then I'm just left with that x plus 8. And since this is a binomial and this is a monomial, I can't do anything else. That's my answer. Okay, we're going to merge this into one fraction. I'm going to go ahead and take my 20x squared minus the 60x plus 6x cubed. Now, is there anything I can reduce or cancel or anything? Well, maybe just put them in the right order. Now we're going to try to factor this numerator, which I can factor out a 2x. And you might try magic number right here to continue factor, but it's not going to work out, so I'm just going to save you some time. But what we can do is reduce these monomials. So 2 and 24 makes a 12 on the bottom. X and x cubed makes an x squared on the bottom. So there's our final answer. Alright, we're going to merge these together. So we have x squared, we can just join these right now. Minus 2x, minus 3, minus x, but hang on, there's a minus this as well. So that gives me x squared. We still have like terms here. And like terms here. And then we try to factor this, which we can't. There's nothing that will multiply to give me this and add up to this, so then we're done. But we try. You have to try to factor. So let's recap here. What we did is we factored our denominator, we got a common denominator, we had to change the numerator. So once all that was intact, then we merged it into one fraction, and then we factored anything we still could, so we can try to reduce monomials or try to cancel binomials and trinomials, etc.